Thank you. I'm so excited to be here and get a chance to talk about this book. Usually when I'm talking or giving book talks, my audience is between 8 and 9 years old. It's right after recess, so it's a pretty tough crowd, and I spend most of my time talking about ancient Egypt. I should say I am going to talk a little bit about ancient Egypt because I'm not only a teacher, I'm a history teacher. I'm a student as well, finishing a PhD at NYU, but I'm also a writer. And I find that this topic of meditation and mindfulness sort of brings, in a strange way, all three of those pieces of myself together, and hopefully I can touch on those as I share with you this book tonight and these principles and ideas. First thing I want to do, though, is talk about what this talk isn't, and really what the book is not. It's not a manual. It's not a solution to all the problems plaguing education, and it's not a simple answer. And I think when we think about yoga and meditation and mindfulness, we often, like so many reforms that take place in schools, we see them as these magic solutions to all the problems. But in reality, for me, meditation is a beginning. It's a starting place and a reorientation of what we value and what we want to focus on within our classrooms and within the lives of our students. I want to use three different questions to sort of guide my conversation and talk this evening. The first is this idea of sort of how have we gotten to the place we're at today within schools. I think it's so important to understand the context, and that's not just as a historian, but I think it explains a lot of the reforms that you currently see. The second question that I hope I can address tonight is this idea of how do we connect to the hearts of our students? So how do we start to move beyond the head and start to focus on the heart and the whole being of the student? And really the last question, and it's probably the most important as it relates to this book, is what's the place of meditation in a 21st century classroom? You hear a lot about this idea of 21st century skills, and where does meditation fit in with those skills? So hopefully over the course of this talk, I can both answer those questions directly and indirectly. But I thought a good place would sort of be a little background about myself and my own journey into meditation as well into teaching. And interestingly enough, I thought I would start where I usually start my book talks when I'm talking to third and fourth graders, and that's ancient Egypt. And you know, when you're dealing with some kids after lunch, you really got to hook them and hook them fast. And when you're dealing with adults at night, it's probably the same thing, right? So Egypt's a great place to start, and the story that always captures their attention is the story of the discovery of King Tut's tomb, right? And I always think, you know, in 1922, at that point, Howard Carter had been looking for this tomb in the desert in the Valley of the Kings for 4 years. And the story goes, it's actually the anniversary of this discovery. It's very soon, in November, about 2 weeks before he ran out of money, and the funding was cut and he was going to have to go back to England. It was just by chance that one of his workers stumbled upon this step, almost like a piece of rubble. When they dug it away, they discovered a step in the desert, in the floor of the desert. They dug for 2 days and nights. They found 13 steps, and at the bottom was this doorway, which we all now know is the discovery of King Tut's tomb. This tomb completely changed our understanding of ancient Egypt. It basically gave birth to an era in Egyptian history we had no idea about. And in many ways, and it's a strange connection, but I think sort of my experiences in middle school were like that desert Howard Carter was digging in, right? I mean, I think we can all admit that middle school is a tough time, and it can be a pretty barren landscape. And for me, when my uncle introduced me to meditation in 8th grade, it was like finding that step. And on the other side of that step, at the bottom of those stairs, it's the practice of meditation, which has really opened up so many gifts and treasures in my own life and a richness that I never would have expected. So in 8th grade, somehow I got interested in this idea of meditation. And I guess we're all looking for meaning, particularly when we're an adolescent trying to make sense of our lives. And I grew up in a suburb of Detroit. And my uncle was a deacon, a Catholic deacon, but he also was a professor that taught at one of the local colleges, and he taught world religions. And so he had some connections with different religious leaders in the community, and he heard I was interested in meditation. So he said, Bill, let's go down into the city, let's go down to Detroit, and we're actually gonna go down to Hamtramck, which is, strangely enough, if you know Detroit, Hamtramck is a city within the city. And it's actually a very diverse immigrant community that lives there. And he said, we're gonna go down there, and I know a Zen Buddhist monk, and I'd like to introduce you to him. So I can vividly remember taking that trip down there, going into this side street, and Hamtramck, it's a pretty tough neighborhood, abandoned houses and empty lots. And then there's this one house. We parked in the car in front of it. We got out, we walked up the stairs, and there on the side of the door was a small sign that said Detroit Zen Center. It's probably the last place you expect to meet a Buddhist monk is in the middle of Detroit. And we walked inside, and we were led up the stairs, and I remember sitting down, and across from us was this Buddhist monk, Zanbo, and he was sitting with his eyes closed, and the woman who brought us up the stairs motioned and said, basically sit down on these 2 mats. So we sat down, and we sat there, and I was kind of like, what's going on? Is he asleep? Is he gonna wake up? And he opened up his eyes, and he said something I'll never forget. And he said to me, and I think he was saying this probably to my uncle more, but he said, it's taken you hundreds of lives to get here to this moment. Now, when you're any age, that's kind of like a whoa statement. It really thrusts you into the present. And over the next 2 hours, we had this incredible conversation that touched on all these topics, and he answered every question I asked. I remember seeing my sister later in the day. She said, so how was it? I said, it was amazing. And she said, what did the Buddhist monk say to you? And I said, I have no idea, right? I could not remember a word of it. This probably sounds like most of my students after my classes, right? But the feeling of presence, the feeling of being there with him and being with someone who was fully there with me was something I would never forget. And it's interesting because I began to practice meditation as a student, and it was at the end of the night after doing homework, working all day, I'd lay down, could not fall asleep. It probably is something we all struggle with at times, even as adults. And when I began to meditate, I could fall asleep a little faster. And then what I would do is I might meditate before I took a test, and I had a little more clarity, a little better memory. Then I started to meditate before big tournaments or athletic events, and I found I just could be at the right place at the right time. I had a better flow to my game. And then the interesting thing is I began to meditate before I caddied. I caddied in the summer. I found when I meditated, I could read the greens better, which earned me more money and tips and all this stuff. So it's really this perpetual cycle. But I can't say I meditated consistently from that point to this point. And there were definitely times and places when I sort of strayed and my practice fell to the side. And honestly, those are probably the times I needed it the most. But when I got into teaching, somehow that path and that practice and I converged again, and I began to meditate. And it probably had something to do with the 120 students I was teaching in the city, probably had something to do with the over 200 parents I was dealing with, or my administration. But it was more than just helping me sleep. Again, I found that when I cultivated this practice in my life, I just had better timing, I had better intuition, I could connect with my students more. And this became just as important to me as the curriculum that I developed, the lesson plans that I made. Meditation was a central part of my pedagogy and my practice. And it was because of that that I began to bring it more and more into my classroom and into the lives of my students. Now, before I get into that, I think it's important to think about what does the lives of these students look like? How did we get to this place and this point? And sort of this next piece is the historian in me. And as a history teacher, I look at the current state of education and I think really, and I examine the last 40 years, and you can see the policies and decisions that have created the culture and the climate that we currently exist in. So when I was thinking about, talking about the history of education, I mean, I could go way back. And I also think if you go way back, and we'll touch on some of those pieces, you can see the connection between what a society values and what they teach. I often say to my students, if you want to see what a community or a civilization values, look at the tallest buildings within those civilizations, right? You got Egypt, you've got the pyramids. Medieval Europe, you have the cathedrals, you have the stupas. In India, go to New York City, it's office buildings, right? It's money. And many of their parents, or they have people connected to the banking industry. And in many ways, like, this is one of the gods we worship, right? This is what we value. And what's interesting about our current system of education is this is what it values as well, right? This is how we define success. We have a real emphasis on efficiency. We have a real emphasis on standardization. We have an emphasis on assessment, things that we can quantify. Those are things that we have value. Those are things that have value to us. And when you look at the course of education, you probably could go back to 1983 with The Nation at Risk. I'm not saying this is where it all began, but what's interesting about education, it's one of the topics where there does seem to be a bipartisan effort and consensus that testing is a good thing, so more testing must be even better, right? And as you think about a nation at risk became a nation responds, which became 1,000 points of light, which became goals 2000, no child left behind, race to the top, Common Core, you get the idea. I mean, I always joke with my students, what does it mean that we title a piece of policy and legislation Race to the Top, right? Education has become a race, it's a competition. And it speaks to this focus and this emphasis that exists in our classrooms. And students are feeling this, right? They're feeling this pressure. They're living this experience where they're being tested more. The tests seem to have more implications, not only on their lives, but on the other people's lives in the building and in the community. And the outcomes, I think, are mixed. I mean, I would probably argue they're worse than mixed. But rarely does testing improve learning. It might improve testing and one's ability to take a test, but it doesn't always improve one's learning or what they're retaining. I mean, if I ask my students at the end of the summer how many people have read a book, I might get 3/4 of their hands to raise. Then I ask them, how many of you read a book that wasn't assigned? I'd be lucky in a class of 28 to get 2 kids raising their hands, right? What does that say is what we're losing in this process and what we're saying to them is valued. But it's far worse than that because you see this epidemic within schools today: stress, anxiety, depression, suicide. And I think what you see in terms of the violence that exists, I mean, the realities of shootings within schools, all of this is connected. And this emphasis on just the mind, and particularly just half of the mind, is having huge implications towards our system of education today. So to me, the idea of meditation really does go back, and it's this idea of reorienting ourselves back to the heart. And I talk a lot about the heart in my classes and this idea of nurturing the heart. And I had a pretty profound experience about 6 months ago. I had open heart surgery, right? And this was something I mean, if you ever get a chance to do it, it's something you won't forget, that's for sure. So, I don't know how many of you have had that chance, but, I don't know what you say to someone like, if you get the chance, take it, right? But I had the open heart surgery, and it's interesting because after that surgery, you become acutely aware of first sort of how delicate your heart is, but you also become very aware of just its beating. I mean, you feel this thing in a profound way, and we often talk about the heart, and I talked about the heart to my students for the last 10 years and following their hearts, and all of a sudden I was living this reality. But this is something that other societies and civilizations put so much value in. Going back to Egypt, the heart was the center of the body. I mean, when they mummified these pharaohs, they removed everything from the body, the brain out of the nose, the kidneys out of the back, but they never touched the heart. The heart was the seat of the soul. The heart was where they believed the intelligence resided. In fact, I always say to students, even this ring I wear on my finger, all right, that's connected to marriage, the symbol of marriage, actually goes back to ancient Egypt. There was a vein in this finger that went directly to the heart. And when you made a promise with your heart, you were making a promise that was forever. It was a place outside of time. And when I think about the heart and I think about education, to me, it's about putting the heart once again in the center of the classroom. And the way to do that, or one of the paths to doing that, is meditation, right? That is an entry point into the heart. Now, meditation doesn't just happen, and I think there's like 3 foundational components you have to consider. And these are things I talk a lot about in my book, but the first thing that must be considered is space. In this drive to create these really productive workers, we often don't consider the spaces in which students are living and they're learning. And often when we build spaces today, probably the 2 most important things is building the biggest space you can at the cheapest cost. But in other societies and in the past, there was greater intentionality around the spaces that were created and how those spaces, physical external spaces, impacted the internal spaces of the person experiencing it. A few years ago, I had the chance to take a group of students to London and Paris. If you have any problems with your heart, I would avoid taking 18, 16-year-olds with one other adult to a European country where I remember staying up all night like, oh my God, no meditative practice can get me to sleep. All I'm thinking about is what these kids possibly could be doing in the room next to me. But it turned out to be an amazing experience. And one of the highlights of that trip by far was when we were in Paris, we ended up taking a train outside of the city about 60 miles, about 90 minutes, to the town of Chartres. If you've ever been there, there's an incredible 13th century medieval high Gothic cathedral, probably one of the best examples in Europe and in France. Took the students to this cathedral, and I remember going inside with them and being so struck by the space. First of all, it's these incredible, and that cathedral in particular has the largest collection of medieval stained glass windows from the 13th century, original stained glass windows. So it's this collection of light. It's like that ordinary light of the external is transformed to this magical, sacred light of the internal. Everything about this space draws one inward. And I think the most powerful thing about that cathedral, and the thing that really struck the students especially, was in the center of this cathedral is a labyrinth. What's interesting is they actually don't like people walking it. They cover it up. It's only available once a month. It's probably a Catholic church thing. I'm Catholic, so I feel like it gives me some leg room here. They cover that up. This is a Druidic symbol, but what's interesting about the symbol is I always ask students, what's a labyrinth? And they'll say it's a maze, but it's not a maze. There's only one path in a labyrinth, and the path leads to the center, right? The labyrinth is the symbol of the journey into the heart. It's like the mandala in Buddhist traditions, right? This is a model, it's a map of the interior. And when we took this trip in there, I remember coming out afterwards and I could just sense that the students wanted to have an experience of some sort. Everything has been speaking about going inward. And I could sense that we needed something more to really reflect and capture this experience. We ended up finding a spot in the garden behind the cathedral where we sat down and did a meditation. It was one of the highlights of those 10 days in Europe by far. And honestly, it wasn't just the meditation, the experience of meditating there, but it was how that deepened the connection between the group, and it literally was a shift in everything that happened afterwards. It was almost like a heart opening, just like that cathedral had been built. So when I came back to my own classroom, I began to revisit the space. Like, what's the space look like in my classroom? What is the space speaking and saying to my students? So a couple of things that I've learned and brought back. One is I almost never close the shades. in the space. I try to bring in as much natural light into the classroom as possible. I have this dream one day that actually students won't face boards, they'll face windows. And teachers will write on the windows. And students will be looking out the windows. And there's so much work and study that's shown that when you actually look out a window, if you can see 20 or 30 feet, that you get more expansive in your thoughts, your creativity. All day we have students sitting and staring at walls, right? I mean, it's kind of crazy. The other piece too is students are so aware of time. And what was interesting about being in that cathedral is it seemed like a place outside of time. So what I started to do is cover up the clocks in my own classroom walls. And this is, I think, some administrators aren't so happy about that, right? And not only did I cover them, one or two might have been damaged along the way. I don't know how that happened. But removing students from the constant presence and awareness of time, right? Allowing them to have conversations that aren't always quantified by that. Considering what I hang on the walls, I work in a K through 12 school. Elementary school teachers are much better at this than high school teachers, but taking the work and the lives of students and putting them on the walls, bringing color into the classroom. But the most important thing I took out of that experience is circles. The labyrinth is a powerful circle, it's a powerful shape. But this idea of circle is something that transcends just the medieval world. I was reading a book, you may have heard of it, Black Elk Speaks. And Black Elk is one of the last, or in the 1890s, he was a Sioux medicine man. And he had this great quote, and he said, "The power of the world always works in circles. Everything tries to be round." And whenever I lead a meditation, whenever I want a meaningful conversation, I always put my class in a circle, right? And I found just that simple act of moving out of that square state, rectangular state of the classroom into a circle is a transformative one. Now, space is a key ingredient to a successful meditation, but so is time and timing. You can't just do a meditation. You can't just do it the first day. I think they tell teachers, don't smile until Thanksgiving, right? So all this year I have not cracked a smile. I want you guys to know that. But in truth, there's some truth to that statement. At least don't smile the first week or two, right? But honestly, you probably don't want to lead a meditation until Thanksgiving either. And finding time and timing to lead a successful meditation is so important. And the first time I led a meditation with my whole class, it was in 2012. And up to that point, I had been part of a meditation club, and we had meditated at lunch with groups of students. But in 2012, if you remember, the world was supposed to end, right? In December of 2012, kids really were into this, right? And I remember thinking I should do something special if the world doesn't end. Or if it does end, might as well lead a meditation, and then if I lose my job, no big deal, right? So it was right around that date. I think it was like December 20th, 21st, the solstice. We actually had an incredible conversation about this notion of cycles of time versus linear time. In a Western culture, we focus a lot about these ideas of linear time. And in education, what that means and implies, constant progress, right? Students feel like they can't make mistakes, right? They can't fall off the line, they're walking this tightrope. But cycles and circles repeat, they come back, we revisit things, they deepen, we learn. And I use that opportunity to lead this guided meditation. I can remember sitting in a circle with all those students. It's like visiting Zambo that first time and closing my eyes. That was probably one of the biggest risks I've taken as a teacher when I had a group of 30 adolescents in the room and you close your eyes. I mean, you don't know what's gonna happen, right? But they closed their eyes as well. And I remember leading this guided meditation, and we came to the end of it, and I have no idea what I said, but I remember the feeling of community and connection that followed as each one of them shared their experience of what they felt, saw, and reflected on in the course of that meditation. And from that experience, I have gone on, and I don't know how many meditations I've led, probably hundreds. I lead a meditation every Wednesday. I just led one yesterday as part of the meditation club. I lead meditations probably once a month in my classes. And now if I ask students, would you guys like to do a meditation? It's as if I said, do you want to watch a movie? And it's amazing to see the thirst and the interest and the desire to connect to themselves, right? And in connecting to themselves, they're able to connect to one another. So it's not just having the space, it's not just having the right time, it's also having the right intention. That's the third ingredient, which I think is so important to really transforming the classroom and creating a successful practice. So many times our intentions don't always align with our actions. Many times, sometimes my wife might ask me to go out with some of her friends, or we might go to some family, out with some family, and my intention is like, I don't really want to be here. And at the end, she might say to me something like, you didn't bring much to the table. And my thought is, well, I was there physically, right? But mentally, emotionally, I wasn't there. And when we think about meditation in the classroom, it's even so much more. I think students can sense authenticity better than anyone else, right? And if you are not authentic, if you don't have your own personal practice, if you don't believe in what you're asking them, and if you don't embody what you're asking them to do, they won't do it, right? It's aligning that sense of intention to what we're saying, what we're practicing, what we're offering, which is really transformative. So this idea of space, time, intention, these foundational components of meditation have really allowed me to expand this practice and bring it to so many different groups of people, not just my students, but I now lead meditations with a group of parents on Thursday nights. I've led meditations after tragedy within the school. I've led meditations for sports teams before playoff games. I've led meditations in the elementary school, secretaries, administrators, all across the building. And I think the last piece I want to end with is sort of the big guidelines that I would offer if you are interested in this work. And it doesn't have to be in schools, in any environment. And in education, we have the Common Core, and I sort of constructed this in response to that, and I call this the Contemplative Core. So I'm not sure how many ideas are in the Common Core, quite honestly. I haven't looked at it that closely, which hopefully doesn't get back to my administration or any important officials in New York State. But I went with 8. Seems like a good number, right? A good number for enlightenment, completion. So the first thing I think it's an important guideline when you're doing this type of work is starting with the space. And I explained that to you, and this is true of any conversation, anything you do, until you're comfortable with the physical space, until people are comfortable with physical space, they don't have the permission or the safety to move into the internal space. The second thing, and I mentioned this already, is it's all about timing, right? And choosing the right time to introduce a practice or introduce a meditation in the classroom with a group of coworkers is just as important as what you say and what you do, right? The timing sets it up in so many ways. And connected to timing is that third piece, which is going slow. You never want to rush any of these practices. You never want to rush the opportunity to reflect. You never want to rush stillness. I once had a friend tell me, you can never go too deep, but you can go too fast. And I think when it comes to students, offering them space and slowness is a real gift in this rush for efficiency and assessment. The fourth thing is be comfortable with silence. When you are going through schools of education, and I've been through several graduate schools of education, they never tell you to bring silence in the classroom. They always teach you how to fill the space. Your voice, students' voices, questions. But learning how to sit with silence can be some of the most transformative gifts you can offer your students and another when they're being reflective or sharing with you something of value and meaning in their lives. Fifth, keep it simple. I often find whenever I try to create things complex, whether it's a lesson plan, whether it's an idea, a book, a story, right? Things get lost. But with meditation in particular, just even connecting to the breath, simple action like 3 breaths can be powerful. Shift the focus away from outcomes and back to process, right? And this goes to a larger shift that I think needs to happen within policy and education. We're so obsessed with numbers, with ratings, evaluations. We've lost this idea of learning and what students are getting out of that experience. Be authentic. This is what I just mentioned. You have to have a practice to teach a practice. You can't offer something you don't have, all right? But the last piece that I wrote is meditate. Now, in some ways, yeah, I mean, jump in, try to meditate with others, try to share that to a group. Maybe it's a group of coworkers or a classroom, or expand that idea of meditation. It's not just about sitting there with your eyes closed and breathing. To me, meditation is about intentional reflection. Maybe that's reading a book, maybe that's journaling, maybe that's going for a walk and listening to music, thinking about an experience you had, but creating those spaces within your own life and the lives of others is very, very powerful. A story that I'll end with here sort of connects back to Egypt in some ways, because the Egyptians were very much connected to the stars. And I love this story about the Hubble Telescope recently. And so many of my students, I'll ask my students, when was the last time you looked at the stars? And it sort of speaks volumes how rarely they see the stars, how rarely they think about the stars, and even the expansiveness of what that means. But when they had the Hubble, early on in the commissioning of the Hubble, almost every minute, hour, day of the Hubble, the life of the Hubble, has been accounted for different experiments. And there were a group of scientists who had a really radical idea. They wanted to take the Hubble and point it into one of the darkest spots in the sky where there appeared to be nothing. They wanted to take the Hubble and point it not just for a few hours, but they wanted to point it into this dark space for days and see if they could find anything on the other end. And after they did this for a period of, I think, almost 5 to 7 days, came to the end, and they began to look at the photographs that were being sent back and generated. And they weren't just seeing stars, they were seeing galaxies, entire universes that no one knew existed. And this became known as the deep field image. If you ever get a chance to look it up or take a look at it. To me, that says something. That's what resides within the hearts of our students, within the hearts of young men and women today. We are so hyper-focused on one part of their lives, their being. We're neglecting a whole part of them that has gifts, talents, and worlds that we've yet to discover. I gave a talk yesterday to a group of 9th graders, and it was about study skills. And I might have slipped in a part about life skills at the end. And I left them with this quote, and I thought it would be a nice quote to sort of leave you with. And I think it speaks to the depths of this work and the connection between the heart, meditation, and education. We all live this life to a rhythm deep within our being, a rhythm that only we can hear. Slow down, listen carefully, and when you find that rhythm, make every choice, every action, and every word of your life fall in time with that beat. That will lead to a good life. So thank you very much, and it's been a pleasure to speak.
Thank you. We have time for some questions. If anyone would like to ask him a question, please do so, and we'll get the microphone to you. Any questions? Got one right here. Karen?
Does your book also go through the different age groups so that you have different activities or different suggestions for the K group versus middle school versus high school?
Yeah, that's a great question. The way it breaks down into the chapters, so the first half of the book, I think there's 12 chapters, deals with some of the conceptual framework, this idea of space, time that I mentioned tonight. But the second half looks at specific groups and situations. So there's a chapter on elementary school students, high school students, sports teams, field trips, trauma, parents, teachers. So yeah, I think because each group, while there's some foundational common concepts, each group has a different set of needs, and there's an appropriate way of introducing these practices and ideas. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, question. Hey, Carol, back there. No, we got to have it for recording.
We'll have it for recording. There we go.
How are you getting it to all the schools around? That's what I'm interested in. I mean, obviously I'm not teaching school, but how do you get it into all the schools everywhere? Because it sounds like it's much needed. I mean, I need it, and I'm not in school.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think it starts with teachers. And what we've been fortunate to do in my school is we created a fellowship. We received a grant to create a fellowship of teachers last year. We started with those teachers. We actually did a book study with Thich Nhat Hanh's book that came out last year called Happy Teachers Change the World. And we brought in faculty from across the county. And the idea is as teachers become exposed, they bring it into schools. And I think there's a grassroots element to it because you can convince administrators and they're often convinced of a lot of policies and things. But if you don't get that teacher buy-in, there is no sustainability. It doesn't last.
Question, Patrick.
Hey, am I right that the book is not yet released? And if so, when will it be released?
Yeah, you are correct. The book actually comes out in the spring of 2019. So we're just finalizing some pieces with it now. And then there's actually 3 Breaths comes out in the spring, and a second book, which is a picture book, a guided meditation for before bedtime, comes out in the fall, and that's called Big Breath. So you got a little preview of the key core concepts, but the book itself comes out in the spring. Thank you. But you can pre-order it now, which is good to know, on Amazon or any place you can pre-order, but I think Amazon's the dominant one.
Any other questions? Yes. Hey, Sean. Got one right here.
Hi, my name's Sean. I'm a Clinton School student, and I've been reading a couple books about yoga schools and where kids are raised through that. And can you speak to how you are able to persuade more than just those who are really interested in the niche about things that are really difficult to measure?
Yeah, that's a great point, right? How do you, that's so difficult to measure in this culture of everything being quantified, how do you value this piece? I think the piece that's most compelling is this epidemic of anxiety and stress that's existing. Almost on a year-to-year basis, I see students being hospitalized for this. We see it affecting parents in the community. It's so real, it's so present in the lives of parents in particular and watching their kids that this might not have a number next to it, but there's a reality to it. And there's very few parents I know who aren't first and foremost interested in their son or daughter's well-being. And so I find unfortunately, the general ethos and anxiety present within the lives of these young people is so obvious to the adults, particularly their parents, that all of a sudden anything you can offer that potentially could reduce that, help a student process that experience is something powerful. I mean, we did work a few years ago with 5th graders, and I was shocked at the language and the stress that they were describing. I mean, this sense of stress that once I think permeated maybe high school has made its way to middle school, and now is the testing, it's seeping all the way down into elementary school students. They don't have the capacity or the tools to process or make sense of these things, and they're very much overwhelmed by what's happening. And their parents see that. And I think that allows something like this, which isn't quantifiable, to be, people are in some ways so desperate, there's a willingness and an openness to try anything. Thanks.
All right, any other questions? Well, let's give Bill a round of applause. Thank you very much for being here. Great job. Great job. And everybody have a safe trip home, but come visit with him before you leave. Thanks.